everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Now today I am going to be speaking with journalist and author Jonathan Harding. Jonathan, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Brilliant, thanks so much for having me on, Dan.
Absolutely delighted to have you on. Exciting times for you because you've written a book called Mensch, and really excited to talk more and dig in deep into this book.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, definitely. I've had a lot of interesting feedback from different coaches and different professionals as a result of the work. And yeah, it's been really refreshing to feel like the stories I've been able to share with other people and the ideas that I want to generate more of a conversation around are being well received. So exciting time indeed, yes.
Well, before we dive in, why don't you give us a bit of background? I believe you played the game yourself. You're a journalist and author now, but why don't you give us a bit of a potted biography of who you are and how you came to living in Germany?
Well, I mean, I was fortunate enough to live in lots of different countries when I was a child based on my parents' employment. They're both teachers at international schools, so I've been very fortunate to live in lots of different countries, moved around a lot, and that gave me a really good experience of different cultures from a young age. And one of those countries I lived in was Germany, and one of them was Austria, so I've always been around the German language. I studied German at university in England, and straight after my degree I got an internship in Munich, and then I moved on to work freelance work for Germany's international broadcaster, which is where I am now, and I work for a number of different publications out of Germany, and it's been really refreshing to be involved at the level that I'm at. And along the way, I was also playing some football, yes. Not to any, particularly distinguished level, but certainly an enjoyable standard that required a certain level of, commitment and dedication. That was an enjoyable grind, but unfortunately, as my work options, grew in number, I had to make a decision, and that combined with a broken bone, metatarsal, David Beckham, eat your heart out. I had to cut back from football. I still play now for work, but it's far less stressful than it used to be in the past. But yeah, no, I've played football all through my life, as I'm sure many people have, an amateur and a semi-pro level. It was great. It's great fun, and look back on it with fond memories. But to be involved with football in any capacity or sport in any capacity is really it's an exciting thing to be involved in, because sport is in many ways something that can break boundaries like no other thing. So it's it's been a great ride, and I feel like I'm just beginning. So.
Well, as when we spoke off air, I said this is going to be a podcast of embarrassment for me, because I'm going to try my finest German pronunciations, which are probably going to be poor. You'll be correcting me all over the place, which is absolutely fine, because you've written this book, Mensch. Am I pronouncing that right to start with?
Yes, absolutely.
Brilliant, great. We've got it right to begin with. And it's a book about coaching. It's a book about football coaching in Germany, German coaching, German coaches. And I just think it's, I jumped at the chance to get you on the Sports Psych Show, because I just think that is a footballing, a soccer country rich with playing ability, coaching ability. So I thought, wow, here is a book that breaks this down, and I was really excited to get you on. And I've made my way through the book. I've made plenty of notes. I've learnt loads, recognised some names, didn't recognise other names, and which was really, really exciting, really interesting to learn about some coaches I didn't know about. So we're going to make our way through this book.
Sounds exciting. Let's do it.
Brilliant. Well, each chapter has a German name attached to it, because in the German language, I assume that a word can represent a number of sort of definitions, a number of words. Yeah,
that's true, and I think the German language has suffered, for understandable reasons, over the years, historical context, as being quite a harsh language. But there is quite a beauty and a logic to the German language that deserves some recognition in a more modern setting. And one of the things that's so great about language, not just German, but all the languages that are available in the world, there are so many cultural sentiments that are attached to words, and some things just don't translate. And I think it's good to give the word in the original language and try and explain best how it's used and what the context around that word is. And I thought it was a nice way to have the heading of each chapter be around a character trait, basically, of a coach that, I think is necessary or applies to the coaching question in that chapter. Put it in German and then give the context. For example, the first one is Leidenschaft, which is passion. But the great thing about that word, as I talk about in the book, is that Leiden, the German word, if you split that word up, is to suffer. And actually, anyone who's passionate about anything will know that there is a degree of suffering in pursuing one's passion. So there is a great logic to the German language, and in some ways it was too beautiful not to talk about. So I'm glad that it comes across well.
In that first chapter, you talk about a former coach of yours, I believe, Sasha.
Sasha Oxendorf, yeah.
Right, and he sounded like quite a, you use this word Leidenschaft and passionate. He sounded like quite a passionate guy, quite a passionate coach.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he still is. I'm in touch with him, and when he gave him the copy of the book, he was really overwhelmed, and it was a special time because we both arrived at the club at the same time, and we're both working from scratch, and he had a certain way of doing things, and it didn't work for everybody, but it worked for me. And I talk about that basic level of seeing an improvement in yourself, and you can apply that to any level of sport, whether it is an amateur level or whether it's a professional level. If you recognize that and you've got the right person in front of you, then it makes such a difference to your approach to training and your desire to be a part and to commit to something. And he was great for me in that respect. He was tough, there's no doubt about it, but I benefited from that toughness. He wasn't soft on us in ways that I think maybe would have been sort of too pampering. It's always hard. I think one of the things a couple of people have said to me, you get to the end of the chapter and you think, what an interesting character, what a great guy, and yet how is it that he doesn't have any badges, or how is it that you didn't win any games, really? Our record wasn't that great. And at that point, for me, it wasn't about winning games, it was about the development, and it was about having fun on a Saturday and being involved, and he wanted that as well, but of course he wanted to win, and he had that competitive streak. But he talks about so many different aspects of amateur football, and the hardest part is convincing people to be involved in running around the organisation, because no one's there the same way in the pros. The pros are obviously paid, and it's a different level of motivation. I can say, though, that since speaking to him in the last few months, that he is working towards getting his badges now, and I think he's come full in his development, and I think he's looking towards progressing as a coach, and he's recognised and he's grown and he wants to develop in different ways, and I think that's been the most heartwarming thing. He's a really talented guy. He's got a unique way of approaching some situations, but he's learned so much in the last few years, and now he's willing to take on more knowledge. So I wish the absolute best for him, because he was really great for me, and I'm confident he can be a special coach for another group of players.
It's really interesting, Jonathan, because as I was reading it, I really felt this tension that he was feeling, Sasha was feeling, in terms of he's this enormously passionate guy, this personality characteristic, if you like, of passion, and yet he's coaching at, say, this amateur level, and just I don't know if the amateur level demands that striking of a balance between, be passionate, but hey, it's still amateur, calm down type thing. But he didn't want to calm down, and he wanted everything to be done meticulously, and he took it enormously seriously, and there seemed to be that tension there, and it's a tension that I recognise with grassroots coaches, really passionate grassroots coaches, whereby there might be something in the back of their mind saying, hey, this is just grassroots, but something in the front of their mind going, yeah, but no, I want to do this job at 100%. And that tension between being able to and having the resources and the facilities, or not having the resources and the facilities, but actually having the will and the motivation to do so, that tension was palpable in that chapter, I felt.
Yeah, and that's the hard part, because he is certainly somewhere in between, and he was always a coach that demanded the most from you. And I think part of the problem at the amateur level is, how do you convince a group of individuals that they are part of a team, that they are striving for something, when the only motivation for being there is their love for the game? You can't. It's hard to dictate, don't go out on a Saturday and have 5 beers and then come on a Sunday for match day and not be ready. It's difficult. You can't control people's lives. But on the flip side, like he said, the truth is, if on a Sunday you pick up an injury, that's the kind of damage that is done across your entire life. It's not the same as being a professional footballer, and obviously injury in any case is not an easy situation, but you're going to get brilliant treatment. You're going to be on the road to recovery. You've got a team looking after your rehab. You're playing in an amateur league and you do something to your knee. That affects not only your desire to play, but also your everyday life. Maybe you're not as mobile as you used to be. Now you can't go to the shop. Now you can't drive to work, whatever it is. And I felt that Sasha took that into consideration. He was juggling so many things as a dad and as a man himself. But he was still arriving with that level of passion. And I think it is hard. I think it is hard for coaches who are so desperate to do the job right and so desperate to get a group feeling like they are a special group. And yet, on the other hand, you're consciously aware that this isn't the Bundesliga, and you're not working towards a goal. Not people aren't being paid. There's not that much at stake. But I really like that, because I like that he was up for it and that he wanted to make the most of the situation. Because the argument is, if you want to have a kick around, then go down the park with your friends. We play in a league. We train twice a week. I think everybody who was at the team certainly recognised that we were here to work hard, and for myself, it really benefited my development. But I enjoyed his approach.
Yeah, absolutely, and it reminds me of the amateur players who contact me, and they'll be quite sheepish about it, because they'll think, well, my mates, my friends would think this is ridiculous because I just play for fun. But you can play for fun but still want to be the very best that you can be, and so seeking out sports psychologists might seem over the top, but it's absolutely not. And I really love it when somebody contacts me and it's not their profession, it's not their living, but they just want to get better.
Yeah. And that's it, End of the day, all you want to do is just get better. And it doesn't matter what level you play at. That grind and that determination to be a better, player, certainly something that I recognise. And it makes such a difference when you see it yourself and you can recognise it. And I don't think there's much difference between amateur level development and professional level development in terms of what it means to the individual. I think it really does spur you on.
People want to be competent, and that brings us neatly onto the second chapter, which is entitled Competence. Again, pronunciation, but brilliant chapter. And what leapt out of me, and I want to, before I say this, I want to reinforce, as I do quite often at the Sports Site show, how brilliant I think the English FA are with their training and development now, and it's becoming an outstanding learning and training and development program. But what stood out to me, this chapter is about developing competence and the hours and hours of instruction that coaches in Germany have. 800 hours of guided learning as opposed to 245 in the UK. I mean, wow, that's a difference, isn't it?
And that's the thing that really stood out. You're right. And Frank said to me, I said, what is that about? And I think it's important to stress that the minimum that UEFA sets is obviously a minimum based on facilities and possibilities and finance. And Germany are able to do 800 because, they have the money and the facilities available. But I asked him, I said, what's that about? That's an enormous leap. And he said, look, if we want to do something right in Germany, we're going to do it right. We want to do something properly. We want to do it to the full degree.
And this was Frank Wormuth?
Frank Wormuth, yeah.
Wormuth.
He is now coaching in Holland, and the guy who's taken over, ironically, was the guy I spoke to in one of the latest chapters, Daniel Dinkowski. But I met both of them on the same day. But, it was so insightful to see him talk about the way that they approach that top-level coaching. And what that means to me is that there's so many more hours spent studying and practicing the theory. Now, obviously, German youth football has come in for a bit of criticism in recent years about whether that's necessarily the right way to go, and coaches are coaching too heavily on the tactical side. But there's no doubt that you're giving coaches an unbelievable foundation to work off. And I think that can never really be seen as a negative. Maybe you need to make adjustments, but in some areas, whether, changing the youth football approach as they have done in recent months. But yeah, I mean, when you look at the breadth of the course and the amount of variety that top-level coaches, so Fußball Lehrer, which is the FA equivalent of the level 5,
yep.
You're talking about an unbelievable skill set that you're effectively, arming your top-level coaches with. And I could only come away from that situation being encouraged about the competence of these coaches.
And in terms of that football Lehrer course, so that's the main course that coaches aspire to. What does that look like? Because I know I think you sat in on a few of the presentations. What does that look like? Who's delivering that?
Well, Frank, it's extremely complicated, and I can tell you to break that down into a chapter, into an edible size of text was not easy. But basically, the course is spent over the year, and there are various modules throughout it. And I won't go into too much of the detail because it is quite complicated. But Frank is in charge, or he used to be, and now Daniel is. But the point is that the way that they deliver that course is not I tell you do. It's very much a case of, let's talk about this. But Frank was very wary. He always used to say, and I know Daniel follows a similar approach, I can enter the room and tell you what to do, but I would much rather enter the room and you tell me what you think you should do, and then I could tell you what you might also do. And that's a different way of learning. It's a very subtle difference, but I think it makes such a difference. I think Frank said at one point in the book, my task or our task as coaches is not to say that you can't do it. That's not what we're there for. You can't make a personality, you can't change them, but it's there to give them an opportunity and say, well, maybe look at the glass half full, or maybe change your perspective, and maybe reframe it in a different way. That's what really encouraged me the most. He's in charge of it, and there are different modules along the way, covering an absolute breadth of topics that really gives top-level coaches the best possibility to coach. One thing that really fascinated me, though, was the preparation for club management. So, for example, they would practice scenarios in which they would practice the boardroom interview for a job, or they would practice the first speech with a team in a dressing room. Situations like that. Situational development is so important, because obviously you can't simulate all the real effects of being in that situation, but to have some level of preparation is so important. And Frank was saying that they often, right at the start of the course, they'll bring them in and they'll film them doing a speech right at the beginning, and then they'll compare it to the end, and you can see the development in public speaking and authority and confidence. And it's, it sounds like something simple, and it sounds like something that should be on every course, but as is always the case, it's the small things that make the biggest difference.
A subject that comes up over and over again on the Sports Psych Show is autonomy supportive coaching versus controlled coaching.
Yes.
And in terms of teacher training or coach training, it sounds very much like what coaches experience on the football Lehrer course is autonomy supportive. So what have you got? How do you see the world? How do you see coaching? Now, here are some things that you can add to that, or here are some questions around that actually might get you thinking about things in a different way. And that almost feels, and please excuse me if this sounds stunningly stereotypical, that almost feels un-Germanic. I suppose my view would be a German trait would be very controlled coaching, very much you do this, you do that, this is the right way, this is the most efficient way. I'm guessing I'm completely wrong and out of step with that.
No, I think it's just changing. I think a lot of young coaches, particularly in the Bundesliga and the second division, have come through a different way. And you got to go back to the academy change in 2000. Germany had a terrible Euros. They made changes on a national level. They brought in the academy system, and that's really the reason why, along with great coaching, that they won the World Cup 14 years later. That was the end of an entire process. So when you take that into consideration, the other thing that nobody talks about is that along with the arrival of all these great talented players in the academy system, you had coaches who were accompanying them along the way. So further down the line, these coaches would end up coaching first teams and be like, oh, Marco, I used to coach you at youth level. Here I am now coaching you in the first team. And I think that makes a difference, not only for the player, but for the coach. One of the coaches I speak to later on, this concept of this generation that I sort of call Generation Y, players are far more inquisitive now. They want to know not just, let's not just do the drill. Please explain to me why you're doing the drill. So, for example, you could have a basic set-piece routine, and you could say, well, I want you to take this corner, and I want you to make sure that, when your teammate puts the ball in, you're going to make the dummy run to the front post. You just run there. And most players, maybe 10, 15 years ago, would have gone, okay. But now the question is, well, why do you want me to do that? So coaches are now adapting to that, and they're saying, look, if we take the corner this way and you make the run to the near post, you drag two players out, and that leaves a big hole in the middle, and we're more likely to score. Now, he's going to do that because he understands the reason why. And, that change in coaching has had a massive impact on the players, and it's also worked vice versa. So I think it's just changing the type of coach. I don't think it was necessarily just a German trait either. I think 10, 15 years ago, I think we saw a lot of coaches in the Premier League who were probably very much a, bark instructions and follow this lead. And I think the style of coaching generally is developing and changing as we move into an era now where we're more conscious that the player has a far greater level of intelligence based on the academy systems that they've been through, but also there's a far greater sense of awareness for understanding the person behind the player, and that shouting at people and berating people is not the best way to get the best out of the person. Yes, you can be firm and you can demand and set high standards, but there's a very fine line between doing that and pushing someone too far. So I just think it's changed and the culture's changed, and Germany's benefited from having a lot of young coaches be developed at youth level, which is highly respected here, and I don't think that's the case in England. The work done at youth level is really respected here, and that work has then allowed them to move into the first team, and ultimately you're going to have a far more well-rounded coach in that situation who's going to approach things differently.
Well, we're certainly going to talk more about the person behind the player. And what hit me in that chapter was describing the Football Lehrer course. You mentioned that they have 2 psychologists on site, or part-time, or however it works, as consultants, delivering some psychological stuff. And moving on to the 3rd chapter, entitled Lehrer, which means teachers, you actually mentioned some sports psychologists who function in the game in Germany, one of whom is Professor Jan Meyer, who's the sports psych at Hoffenheim. And interviewing or talking with somebody about German football and not mentioning the Hoffenheim manager Julian Nagelsmann would be remiss of me. So he has a sports psychologist, this Professor Jan Meyer, who really interesting. In the chapter, you talk about how Jan talks about the amazing interpersonal skills that Julian Nagelsmann has.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that separates him. Obviously a guy who comes into a first team at such a young age, and he's 28, 29 when he first came in, you need to have that type of aura around you and your ability to sort of navigate and be around young people and not be intimidated. And I think for a sports psychologist in that position to observe that and say, they were so impressed by the things that they saw from him, certainly left an impact on me. I mean, Nagelsmann is obviously a very, very smart man, and he understands, I think, in a really smart way, what it is to coach a younger generation. I think what's important is that, not just in football, but in life, I certainly feel that the generational gap between generations is growing. So, for example, the gap between myself and my parents used to just be the generation gap. I think there is now a gap between someone of my age and someone who is, 15, 16. And then for a 16-year-old, there is also now a gap on a 10-year-old. The gaps are going, smaller in number, but bigger in terms of the difference. And as a coach, to be able to navigate that space, that's extremely difficult. He has to understand what to say, when to say it, do I say it now? What tone do I use? And I think Nagelsmann has benefited, from coaching such a vast amount at youth level, but also recognizing how to handle different people at different ages. He has never been intimidated by players that are older than him or who have more experience. And everybody who's been in his teams has always said, yeah, he knows what to say and he knows when to say it, and he's got a great aura about him. I never think about the fact that he's so young. So there's certainly a level of competence that comes with him doing that job, because I think, if you're going to do that job at that level, you have to be respected on how much you know. But on a second level, he understands people. At least he understands the people that he works with brilliantly. And he's got some, as you say, and as Jan Meyer told me, he's got some great interpersonal skills, something that I think is, completely underrated and not spoken about enough in any profession. You can, it's not just football, but if you want the best out of your team, whether it's at school as a group of teachers, whether it's in business, your employees, or whether it's football and your staff or your players, you have to treat them as individuals and you have to look out for them and you have to understand them so that when these difficult situations arise, you know the right thing to say at the right time. And, Nagelsmann's obviously got a great feeling for that. It will be telling to see how he handles it at Leipzig because it's a different setting. He didn't work at the youth level there. And that's a bit of a new environment for him. But he's obviously grown and developed as a coach in the last few years, and he does have the advantage of having Ralf Rangnick at his side, as it were, at that team. So, yeah, it would be interesting to see, but there's no doubt that he's a very talented coach, not just in terms of his tactical perspective.
You touch upon sports psychology in this chapter. You talk about Dr. Niels Gatsmacher, who utilises personality cards. The comments around that were a bit of uncertainty there. You talk about Professor Matthias Lochmann from the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. This is stretching me here, Jonathan.
You're doing brilliant.
And how he's talking about embedding more game intelligence. But it's really interesting to read that chapter because, and I'd like to get your comment on this, because there seems to be a tension in your own mind as to, and is this the same with German football and German coaches, is where does sports psychology fit in? How do we fit this in? How does this work? The personality cards, it sounded like you had a bit of scepticism around this. So
yes,
what's your thoughts?
Well, I am sceptical about it to some degree. I think German coaching is certainly recognising the need for sports psychologists. You can listen to what Per Mertesacker has had to say in recent years about that as well. He's talked about that. But I think it's still not quite where it needs to be, German football, in terms of recognising the need for that and the protection of that, of players, and giving them the space and the time that they need. I think they do a great job of having people in the right place, but there's a difference between having people in the right place and then them obviously being able to provide the practice and the care that they need. I still think they're, obviously I'm not a player in a changing room, so I can't comment, but I think from where I'm standing, it certainly still feels like there's a level of stigma about going to a sports psychologist. That obviously needs to change because the mental health of players is really important. I'm sceptical not about that profession. I think it's a hugely important profession that needs to be in greater light and to have greater appreciation, particularly in the game, because I don't think you can have enough support around players, but also around coaches, and I think coaches are perhaps a little bit neglected. I am sceptical about the concept of personality ratings. Obviously, I'm not coming from a clinical background or from a psychological background here, but it does seem to me that surely there's a much better way to assess someone's personality than testing. And to have a character card, based on the video game FIFA, which is obviously a way to make that information accessible and tangible for your players, especially in the next generation. Lots of younger players play that video game. So if you do it that way, it makes it cool, and that absolutely makes sense. But how on earth is an obscure number, say 55 or 70, for personality? What does that actually mean? I think there's a lot of ambiguity there. Is there a way to say that a 99 personality is good? What does that mean? Does that mean you're a better person? How is that rated? Surely that's objective. Who's making that decision? And I also think that that's a little bit strange to sort of suggest that there's a way to rate that. And how have you gone about that? Have you asked them 10 questions in a questionnaire and then based on their answers created a personality mold off the back of that? I think it's much easier not to put a number to something like that, but to actually have a conversation with someone and put them in experiences, or give them experiences and put them in situations where they have to truly test themselves. What are they like if you say, right, you're cooking dinner for the team this evening? What are they like when you go abroad and you're representing the club and they're an ambassador and, you're there and you're in America or you're in China? What are they like in those situations? That's where you learn more about a person's personality than I think if you test them. I understand the need for numbers. Everybody wants something tangible, especially people upstairs. You've got to measure something and how well is your work going? Let's see some sort of graph. Let's see some sort of progression. But when it comes to personality, I don't know. That's where I'm a little bit, maybe I'm old school, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think that there's, maybe if we started focusing more on the person and actually giving them experiences and developing them and worrying less about the end product, aka the personality or the character, and we return to the work that could be done beforehand, then I think that makes more sense to me. But, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, so perhaps it's just too humble of me or too old-fashioned of me to make that suggestion. But when I saw that, I did sort of raise an eyebrow and think that was an odd way to approach it.
I think it depends what's on the cards. I completely agree with everything you said. I mean, I love personality science. I absolutely adore it. But everything you've said rings true to me. And one has to distinguish between traits and types. There are personality tests out there, such as the Myers-Briggs, that actually delivers a type. So it actually does typecast you. It tells you this is who you are. And that's not what personality science is all about. Let's just say that.
I've done that test and I felt, I mean, obviously you have much more experience with this, but I felt very, very odd because almost in every single question I was in the middle. And I'm like, well, this doesn't fit me at all. I'm not in one of your boxes. And I'm sure I wasn't alone in that situation. I said, this is very conforming. I'm either left or right. Or what if I'm a 5, not a 10 or a 1? You know, and I think a lot of people are somewhere in between. Yeah, okay, there are occasional character traits where you think, yeah, okay, I am pretty loud or I am pretty passionate or I am... You know, but a lot of the time, you sort of feel somewhere in between. So I feel like there's a need to have something more, you know, more modern. Not modern, maybe it's the wrong word, but, you know, less boxy, you know, less, you know, you are this, you are type A, you are type B. I think we're a little bit more, you know, certainly it feels like people are a bit more fluid, a bit more interchangeable.
Well, that's type. And really the more efficacious tests are the, or profiles are the traits, such as the 5-factor personality traits. And let's keep this about German football, but needless to say, I don't disagree, and I'm more invested in mental skills and life skills and well-being and welfare. But I certainly do believe that it's important for players to have mental skills under pressure, and I do believe that coaches need to be equipped to help players in this area. Personality is a highly complex area. But I admire any psychologist who goes to work on helping a club, helping coaches in this area. How one does that is always going to be up for debate.
Yeah,
but
true.
What I like about what you've said, and it leads us neatly onto chapter 4, which is, it sounds as if German coaches, especially young German coaches, are taking a more holistic approach to their coaching, putting the person first before the player, before the performer. And it's interesting in your 4th chapter that's called Vorsprung, which is translated as edge, which leads me to understand that popular advert Vorsprung durch Technik. Now,
correct.
Yes, that was like Audi. Yeah, it's like, wow, it's edge. Right, great, I get it now. So yeah, and this is really interesting. You create that old German belief that it's about leadership and it's about fight, and that's what's going to see us through, and that's what's going to help us win. Similar to that English mentality or British mentality, if you like, but it's changing, and that's what you've alluded to already.
Yeah, and it is changing, and I think what's really interesting to see is that England is changing, and in many ways, if you look at the way that Germany performed in Russia, Germany are reverting. You know, and I think on a club level, Germany are definitely consciously aware of the holistic approach and the need for it. Especially at, you know, Bundesliga first team level, there is a care and an attentiveness, but I think there's definitely more that can be done. I think England has actually done a really good job at youth level in recent years, especially in comparison with Germany, and that deserves recognition. I am a staunch believer in this approach, and you know, when Germany had such a terrible World Cup in Russia, their response was to say, well, we need these values, and my response to that was, do you not think that every changing room in the world has these values pinned on their door? You know, what is really setting you apart is probably how you put those values into practice. You know, recent showing suggests that you're not doing that. So in England, it seems to me, especially with someone like Gareth Southgate, who has completely understood how to create an environment in which those values take, you know, the forefront of the development, and he's created an environment in which players feel safe enough to talk about things that in the past would have been shut down or would have been completely unacceptable. And that is a testament to the way that, you know, Southgate's gone about the job, but also the structure in which he works with and the people he works around that have created an environment that's not just built on, yeah, well, you know, the great British virtue of, you know, fighting and working hard and we'll win because we're more passionate. Well, we recognise that that's not going to do it anymore, and we actually need to be, A, good at the sport in question, but B, that includes great preparation, and C, that includes mental health and care for the players themselves. So it was interesting comparing in the fourth chapter with players that have played in both countries, and talking to them about how they shared how they felt about their experiences and the differences between the two. But I still feel that as good as German coaching is at this level in terms of recognizing the holistic approach and the need for it, I still think that there's a lot more work that can be done.
It's interesting as you're speaking there. The term that comes through to me as a psychologist is psychological safety. And that's being an enabler of vulnerability. You allow vulnerability and you allow mistakes, and we actually talk about it. We don't just shove it under the carpet, and we don't have this, punch the air and we can achieve anything and we're going to fight here, and anybody who thinks otherwise is soft. It's actually to create toughness, if you like, and I don't love that word, but to create toughness, we do need to be softer, we do need to allow vulnerability, and we do need to allow mistakes, and we need to talk about this, because when we talk about this and we bring this out into the open, then it gives people an opportunity to deal with that human quality of vulnerability, that we are going to have anxiety and worry and doubt. It's an inevitability, so let's talk about it, let's put some strategies on the table, let's create an environment that's going to help you deal with it, and so subsequently, actually as a result, we'll probably perform better.
Exactly, yeah, and that's the key, recognizing that adversity is just a necessary hurdle on the road to success, and that success comes in many different forms, and it's not just 2-1 wins on a Saturday. That's absolutely the difference. And changing that mindset is very difficult. When changing a culture that is so driven by result or performance, it's so hard to break away from that and show that the development and the need to consider the things you've just mentioned there as being as important, if not more important, than the result on a Saturday. That's the real challenge.
Now, the next three chapters, chapter 5 is entitled Initiative, which is handily translated as initiative. And then 6 and 7 are part 1, part 2, Erfinder, which is innovator.
Correct.
And really interesting character you introduce the reader to, Helmut Gross.
Helmut Gross.
Gross, okay. And fascinating character, sounds like a real legend of German football.
Absolutely. And it was a privilege to spend time with him. He's obviously seen so much change over the years, not just in football, but in the world. And yeah, it was really interesting to hear him talk about Leipzig's approach to things, but also just how football has changed, and really technical things about how they focus on the sprints and how they're key on, they would like to focus on high dynamics and this idea of reacting quickly in games and having recovery inside of games. And that's how the way that they play football. That might have changed a little bit now, obviously with Nagelsmann being there, but what a guy to talk to. I mean, this is a guy who, I think in the modern generation, often the context of football is only shrunk to the memory of the modern viewer. So anything pre-Premier League is somehow prehistoric. And yet he talks about teams, Lobanovsky's teams, who back in the 70s and 80s, they would be the team that would be pressing, and in a way that, that we now consider something to be really modern. Well, people have been doing it before, and to hear him talk about it and talk about that kind of development and how it's changed over the years it's just fascinating to listen to someone who's seen so much change in football. That was something that I thought was really interesting, and how he handles it, but also how he manages to keep in touch with a younger generation. It's not an easy thing to do for an older coach or an older advisor.
Speed and chaos seems to be his watchwords.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, chaos, when you look at chaos at Leipzig, I love the fact that he said we like to create it, but we like to then control it. That's such a hard thing to do in football, which is such a game that is focused around control and systems and stability. Leipzig, if you watch the opening game of the season, they against Union Berlin, obviously under a different coach, but they were absolutely prolific in squeezing the life out of an opposition who were overwhelmed. And yeah, I mean, if you can start to control chaos, because football is a game full of so many unpredictable situations, if you can start to control a lot of those and make them predictable, then obviously that's going to give you an advantage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it sounds to me, in terms of keeping up with the game, as you say, he's an elder statesman of the game, but he does talk a little bit about the cognitive skills and how it's important for coaches to develop those in players.
Well, he talks about Ralph Hasenhüttl in that sense when he talks about his ability to lead a staff, but not just for players, but also managing a staff and how you need to be able to consider that. Yeah, cognitive development definitely is something that they consider important because they've recognized the need to develop the mind, because they've recognized that the mind needs to be able to process those situations just as fast as the body needs to be able to react to them. And that's also being done at Hoffenheim as well. I don't know whether the staff after Nagelsmann has continued that, but they would work in little video game situations to improve reaction speed. That kind of stuff makes such a difference. And I think it's also, something that a younger generation of player would not just expect, but would also hope for, because it's the kind of development that they can see having such a sharp improvement on their play. If you were able to process things faster in your mind, and I think subliminally, let's bear in mind that we are all probably working at a faster speed than we were 10, 15 years ago. The invention of the smartphone, for better or worse, that is a whole podcast in itself, has forced us to process, vast amounts of information or images at a much faster rate than we were ever normally used to. So I think subliminally that's already happening. So if you start training players in that way, then you're only going to have benefits at the end of it.
Chapter 8, again, I'm going to try this pronunciation here. Is it Reifer?
Reifer, yeah, Reifer.
Reifer, which is maturity. And you interview somebody I've actually met before when I've been over in America, Daniel Nijkovsky.
Yeah.
And really interesting. I mean, this whole chapter is he's taken over, hasn't he, from Frank Wormuth, and is the chief coach instructor at the Football Lehrer course now. But interesting character, and sounds like a great future coach, and actually a little snippet I took out of the book. In terms of people management, it sounds like Daniel's a real people manager, and this is a quote from Daniel. He said this. He said, "I heard Arsene Wenger say once that the most important thing in management is to stay optimistic. I think it's an extremely important personality trait to have, to stay cool under pressure and to transmit confidence. Of course, behind that lies deep knowledge of the game and a plan of how to solve situations, but it's a mix of knowledge and social competence." I really love that.
Yeah, Daniel's definitely the guy that I spoke to. Of everyone I spoke to, I definitely got the feeling off or the vibe off very quickly that he was definitely conscious of the person. He was definitely a kind of coach that was really wary of the holistic approach. Maybe it's because he spent a lot of his time coaching as an assistant coach, or he works also, as I say, with coaches now. But not being the head coach allows you to spend more time perhaps in a direct conversation with players, because you're not so time, your time pressure isn't so harsh, it isn't so stressful.
Interesting. And I've actually stolen another little bit here that I'll get your comment on in a second. Daniel's talking about, I think it might be a colleague of his, Christoph Daum.
Christoph Daum. He's a very famous German coach, not a colleague, but a very famous German coach.
Okay, and he said Christoph Daum told us that he takes notes meticulously after every meeting he has with a player, noting the topic and what the mood and understanding was at the end of the conversation, and whether there was a specific aim to the conversation. I really like this approach and would definitely advise this to any coach who is naturally distant. And I love that. As an aside, I love it, who's naturally distant. So when we talk about personality characteristic,
exactly.
If you're not the most gregarious person, then that to me is where personality science can help, is helping someone be aware of who they are. There's no right, there's no wrong, Jonathan. It's just
exactly
who might you be? Yes, the relationships are, we can kind of see that when we go out for dinner with somebody. We can notice their personality when they're engaging with players or not engaging with players. If there is going to be any testing, what testing can do is to spark some sort of conversation and combine it with what we notice about somebody and help them become more self-aware. And if you are a naturally distant coach, you're not that gregarious, you're not that extroverted, that's fine. Just find ways to overcome that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the things that Frank talked about at the course as well. Your personality doesn't have to be a set way. Whoever you are works for you. And I think part of the problem is that Jurgen Klopp is such a large character, has such a big charisma. that German coaching is often only ever seen through his eyes and, or his vision. And he's now the prime example or the blueprint of German coaches. Well, actually, Jurgen Klopp is in many ways, not very German. And it's not even about where he is and what type of person he is. It's about the characteristics that he has, and that not everybody needs to be that way. And like you say, if you're a slightly more distant or a slightly more reserved coach, don't follow the principles that Jurgen Klopp applies, because they won't work for you. But maybe follow a different approach, and you'll be able to not only get the best out of your coaching ability, but the best out of your players. And that was something that definitely came through, not just with Frank, but also with Daniel, that there's this conscious awareness that whoever you are, there is a way to coach successfully. You just have to find it and develop it.
Absolutely. My first experience of Jurgen Klopp was when I was working for a club, and Liverpool played them in the Carabao Cup over here. And I saw the infamous standing on the centre circle staring at the opposition.
Yes, he does that every game.
It was extraordinary, and all the players afterwards said to me, "Dan, did you see that? What was he doing?" I think it did actually intimidate them.
Yeah, he does have that effect. I mean, he can be both ends of the spectrum, and I think, the other thing to say is that, and I think we sort of touched on this I talked about this in an earlier chapter, is that there is a flip side to that much optimistic, positivity. If you're a player who trains hard every single day and he says to you, "You're doing great, you're fantastic, you're brilliant, he's great, he's developing so well," but you don't play for a month, that's not easy. How do you handle that as an individual? And I think it's also on the coach. It's great to be positive. I would much prefer to see a coach be positive, but it's not an easy thing to manage. You've got to make sure that, because a player is going to recognize that. You can't just, butter them up with nice words, but never actually give them the chance to develop. It's really difficult.
There's a flip side to every personality characteristic.
Absolutely.
And that's where the skill lies. The skill lies in knowing who you are, that self-awareness piece, and then having the capacity, the mental skill, if you like, the inner narrative that helps you to adapt in the moment according to the environment, according to the situation, the context, the player that's in front of you.
Yeah, and you've got to be able to do that. And I think the coaching course does give you the skills to be able to adapt. But like anything, just because you have the tools doesn't mean you're able to put it into practice. You've got to take the theory and be able to recognize how best to apply it and when to apply it. And that's really, I think, where the best coaches in the world separate themselves from the good coaches, because they recognize when and where to apply the right tools. And that's not just tactically, but that's also in terms of, mental development, psychological support, what you need to do, when you need to say it, how to say it. I think the best coaches in the world certainly recognize that, and that's what sets them apart.
I'm going to finish off Daniel's quote because I think it's really good and worthwhile. So he's talking about writing down conversations, and he goes on to say, write it down. You'll notice how often you speak to players and whether you've not spoken to someone in a long time. And contact is pivotal. Players need that. They're focused on their own situation. They want to be taken seriously and appreciated. If you have that contact with them, you can develop it and help players through difficult situations. Sometimes it almost doesn't matter what the topic is as long as you connect. And I just think that's absolutely just an outstanding thing to say.
Yeah, and I a lot of time for Daniel because of the approach that he has. And you think about it in a day-to-day life situation, it's the same. You sometimes you just got to talk to people to break the ice or to connect to someone, and that's where it all starts. I think the real challenge now is that because the power has definitely shifted towards players and their ability to control situations based on the amount of money that's being put around, and agents and entourages and people that are involved in the game, that's certainly made it harder for the coach to approach these situations, because it means you have to be even more considerate and careful when you use your choice of words in these conversations. But at the same time, on a very base human level, I think any individual, if you're open and honest with them and you recognize that they're important and you teach them and you talk to them and you say, look, I want you to be a part of this team. This is the road that we're going down. I want you to be a part of this development. I think if you do that, even if your conversation starts talking about how terrible that movie was that you saw last Friday, you can definitely form a connection and a relationship. And at the end of the day, it's just about relationships. It really is about that. And the word connect is applicable there, because it's not just about contact, it's not just about talking, but it's about forming a connection between two people. And I think if you can do the connection between two people, then the relationship between a coach and a player can only be enhanced as a result.
It strikes me that that's a neat segue to our next chapter, which is entitled Denker, which means thinker. And as you're speaking there, you've got to be a great denker around your people, haven't you? Who is this person? What does this person need?
Yeah, and if you don't think about that, then you're not able to apply the right lessons or the right coaching tips that will enhance the player and even grow the person. If you can't look into their soul and you can't access their personality, then you're going to struggle to be able to develop them as a professional athlete, because you've got to be able to understand what makes them tick. What were they like when they were a child? What process have they been through? What kind of things do they like? What kind of things do they struggle with? You need to have those conversations. You need to be able to go through that kind of thought process. And speaking to Lars Kornetka in this chapter is such a lovely guy, really, really wonderful, and so thoughtful. This is a guy who basically created his job out of nothing. He's video analysis, and before Germany even knew what that was. But he's always thinking outside of his field, and he's always thinking about how to apply things. I mean, I nearly fell off the chair when he was talking about art of war and applying those principles. This is absolutely fantastic. The concept and this picture of football teams reading, picking up art of war. But what he's doing is he's taking the principles out of there and he's applying them, and he's just making people think about situations. You've got to be able to approach things differently, and you can't just have everyone in the room and say, right, we're all going to do this, because it's 18 or 25 or whatever it is, different individuals. And sometimes you need to approach things differently, and people have different needs and different considerations, and it makes it such a difficult job. But there was one thing he said in the book, and I don't know whether you highlighted this, but it certainly struck a chord with me. And it comes back to what we were saying earlier. It comes back to this concept of why. And he was saying, if I tell a soldier to dig a trench and he doesn't know why, he just digs it. But if I tell him to dig a trench to hide himself in, then he knows how deep he needs to make it to cover himself. So again, it's not just do this, but it's this is why you should do it, and have a conversation with it. Then he's more likely to do it better in the times afterwards. And especially when you apply it to a footballer, in game situations where they're not going to have you next to them saying, okay, maybe do this, or maybe we can consider this. And that's so important. And to apply that to a group of individuals where a group approach is perhaps not always something that works is very difficult, but I think extremely important.
It's interesting as you're speaking there, because you're talking about a pioneer in video analysis in German football. And yet this chapter, in many respects, it goes into detail about that, but it does have an underpinning of psychosocial, because this pioneer is essentially saying, well, here's the technology, but we have to utilize this technology effectively, efficaciously, and the only way we're going to do that is we have to take this data, we have to make it palatable, and we have to know when we're going to share information and when we're not going to share information. And it's interesting because it goes neatly onto the next chapter. There's this tension I find, especially in my work, between tactics and, say, the psychosocial side. Which comes first? How do they accompany each other? How do they go together? Because I think everyone says that they do, but they still tend to be separated. And you've got a pioneer in video analysis there sort of talking about that in that chapter. I think it's brilliant. And then the next chapter talks about this concept of Menschenfänger. Pronunciation? Menschenfänger?
Spot on. Doing brilliantly.
Menschenfänger, brilliant. Brilliant translation of people catcher, which does sound like a villain in some kind of child movie.
It does,
or something.
doesn't it?
People catcher, Menschenfänger. But there's a coach that you talk about, or a manager that you talk about in this chapter, called Ismail Atalan, and a great quote here. He says, I always say you can achieve short-term success through tactics, but you have to be a Menschenfänger to achieve long-term success. A head coach that hasn't had success after a year, they're unlikely to be a Menschenfänger. So he's kind of trying to combine. He's saying, yes, look, tactics is really important. Tactics is vital, and actually you can get some quick hits straight away there. But you know what? That's going to wear off if you cannot be a Menschenfänger, if you can't capture your people, if you like.
Yeah, and you've got to have that human approach. And this comes back to that idea of looking after the person, because I think if you have those personal skills, then you're more likely to connect with the person behind the player and not just say, okay, we need to play 3-5-2 and then this is the role that you need to perform on a Saturday. If you're able to connect to someone in a different way, on a more personal approach, then they're more likely to follow you. And that's kind of what this word is about. It's about having someone who's in that situation to lead that you believe in. It's about creating an environment where the belief and the drive behind one person is so great that you get caught up in this feeling of believing I can do anything. Not only is the confidence of myself risen, but I totally believe in the person in front of me, in this case the coach, and their message. And Ismail's such a interesting guy to talk to, because I think in many ways he's been misunderstood by a lot of people. And his time at Bochum, he talks about it, and it sounds like it was a difficult experience for him. But he's come out the other side, and he has such a fresh perspective on life and how he approaches coaching and all of the things that he considers. That it was very touching, very emotional to talk to him, because he was so open, and he was very honest about how he approaches things. And what I liked the most was that he was talking about how so many different aspects of his life impact how he is as a leader. So many different people from so many different walks of life have an impact on how he approaches his ability to coach and to lead. And I think that can make such a big difference. And you're right to point out the quote that you mentioned, because ultimately in the long term, it's how you are with people that can make the biggest difference. It's not whether you change your formation or whether you press or you don't. It's really about how you approach individuals, because whilst it's easy to forget when you're sitting in the stands or you're watching on the television, those players are also people who have the same, feelings and emotions and struggles that we do. And, they need the help and the consideration. Just because they have a lot of money doesn't mean that they are in any better shape equipped to handle those situations. So if you've got a coach who's able to consider that side of things, it makes such a big difference. And it was very poignant when he mentioned Robert Enke, and he talked about that situation. It was very stark to hear this explanation of, think about the fact that they play a game and these lads, they just go home and they're on their own. That's such a hard picture to have in your mind when all you see is the jerseys and the bright lights and the celebrations. But at the end of the day, they also go back to their house or their hotel room and they're on their own. And that's why you need to give them support, and you need to give them the feeling that they matter, and you need to have a conversation with them. You need to connect to them. You can't just be someone who tells them what to do every Saturday. And it was really powerful to have that time with him, and he left a big impact on me for sure.
The next 3 chapters feel like they cluster together.
That's a fair way to look.
Yeah, I just, as I was reading them, they felt like self-skills for coaches and managers. And so chapter 11, Erfahrung, would I be pronouncing that right? Erfahrung experience. My English pronunciation of German words. Erfahrung experience. Philosophy. Oh, you're going to have to help me here because I'm going to embarrass myself. Malocha or Malacher, grafter?
Malocha,
grafter. Good job my self-esteem is high, eh? I'd be
You're doing a great job.
But quite embarrassed here at my linguistic skills. But they cluster together for me, and it's really interesting, because when you do cluster them together, chapter 11 for me, compromise and stress management is important for a coach. Chapter 12, the philosophy chapter, you talk about Coach Christian Streich, who talks about being part of something bigger. It's more than winning. But then you've got a chapter about grafting and being a grafter. Again, there's that tension between, I've got to work really, really hard. It's that tension between self-improvement and self-acceptance that is so often rife in sport. There's not a question there, mate, but why don't you talk to us a bit about that cluster?
I think speaking to those, I spoke to Eckhart Krausen, who some people might know is obviously good friends and well connected with Alex Ferguson. The thing that struck me the most with him is obviously he's travelled so much and he's been to so many countries and coached in so many places, but he still respects the need to centre his mind and to calm himself and find, as he said, that zen where he can sort of bring it down a notch. And I respect that so much from someone who has so much experience, who still has so much passion for the game and still wants to go around and experience so many things. I think it was nice to have them together because you had that experience of, this is important. The idea to meditate and to center on your ideas is matched with the concept of, having a philosophy, recognizing that there's something more and that football is not just about the result on Saturday. But to get to that position, you also have to put quite a lot of work in. And to have these sort of contrasting perspectives, I think it was a nice way to sort of bring it around, especially because Hannes Wolf is the only real head coach at the top level that I spoke to. And he shed some light on that progression to get all the way to the top. I mean, obviously, I know that Ismail has ambitions to get there and he hasn't been able to yet. But when you hear this from someone who's coached in the Bundesliga and have this, has this understanding of how to move forward and what to consider and how hard he's had to work. I really like that. I took the stairs, not the lift approach. There were no shortcuts. I really had to work hard, and it's not an easy way to go. I think obviously again sometimes the perception of coaching from afar looks like this glamorous, wonderful job, and all you have to do is point in this direction and say this and do that. But there are so many interpersonal skills, and you're right to point out that the soft skills are there. I think if I had to pick one thing out of those 3 chapters that really stood out for me the most, though, it's this concept of the game having to be about more than winning. And, that was something that really stuck for me because I don't know whether athletes necessarily have that perspective, but you are literally doing something that millions of people dream of doing and millions of people will never get the chance to do. And to be conscious of that in some respects is obviously completely overwhelming. But in some respects, I think it's sometimes necessary because it puts your feet back on the ground. You appreciate the moment. When, I know this is a previous chapter, but that also matches in with this concept of recognizing and appreciating the moment because it's going to go and it's going to be gone. And sometimes I think it's really important to recognize that. I was fortunate that those stories came together and I was able to tell them in that order. But yeah, I think they're right to cluster, but hopefully they work together quite well.
I think there needs to be something more than winning for every player at the adult elite level and the developing elite level, because not only because of welfare and well-being, which is the obvious direction with which to go, but also actually paradoxically from a competitive perspective, that actually the best competitors are often the ones who, they work so hard to strive to win, and boy, they want to win. But there is a fundamental philosophy in them whereby if they don't win, then they don't win, and that's okay. Sometimes they're going to lose and they move on to next week. It's done, it's dusted, and they build the capacity to go home and shut off and move on. And that isn't the popular Hollywood macho-esque image of being a great competitor, but I think the future is the competitor who sees competing as more than winning.
You have to. I agree. You have to be able to see it as more than that. Not only because to drag bad results or through a season or through your life would be to measure yourself against something that you can no longer change, just like it would be silly if you as an individual took the bad experiences or the mistakes that you've made as an individual and constantly lamented yourself for the choices that you made. That's not an effective way to feel better, but it's also not an effective way to solve and be a better person moving forward. So you've got to be able to process that, and you've got to be able to move through the levels of development and process that are required to not get over it, but to improve. And I think if you, as a player, if you can recognize that the mistakes that were made, even if they weren't directly made by yourself, that it need to be corrected the next time, then absolutely, on we go, move forward. Next week we've got a chance to put it right. At the same time, it's important to recognize that when things do go right, you should take time to appreciate it, because it will go by in a flash. And if we're sometimes we're in danger of not taking enough time to recognise the achievements that we've made and how monumental they are. Because life is such a blink of an eye, really, if you think about it. It goes by so quickly. We really do need to take time sometimes to appreciate those moments along the way. But on the whole, you've got to make sure that you've got the strength of mind to get through and to not take and lament yourself for the mistakes and I don't want to say not failings because that's the wrong word, but the times that you don't win. Because ultimately, some people would say you've already won because you're there.
Our final chapter, entitled Trainer, neatly translated as coach. You say there is a different perspective in Germany now. The age of the point and do coach is over. Generation Y is here, both on the field and in the dugout. So, across this interview, it feels like to be a coach in Germany now, to be a German coach, is to be a coach of people, is to be a Mensch, a people catcher. So what does this mean for German football, do you think? Because you mentioned Russia and crashing out in the early stages, the group stages. What's next? Do you think we're going to see a new German type of player? Do you think we're going to see a successful national team in the next 5-6 years, in the Europeans, in the next World Cup? What's your prediction for the future?
I think Germany has a long way to go on the international stage. There are a plethora of issues that still surround and cloud the national team development. I don't think they're going to be competitive next year. But I think they need to reset, they need to rebuild, they need to recognise that the journey or the movement that they were on that ended in 2014 is well and truly over, and that the mistakes that were made in Russia need to be corrected. So I don't know. I think there's still a way to go for the national team to get back to where they were and on top of the world 5 years ago. As for German coaches, I think the Bundesliga is facing an extremely pivotal moment in the next few years as to whether it wants to go down the route that the Premier League has gone down and whether it wants to make certain changes to its structure that would potentially hamper the development of young coaches. That will be telling in how the development of coaches and players pans out. I would like to see a continuation of the development that's currently in place, because I can't think of another league in the world that really gives opportunities to coaches who've worked at youth level and respects that work and then gives them a chance at the first team level. I really have a lot of time for that. This is a league that gives players the opportunity to develop in the first team in the first league. There isn't very much of that either. So I would hope that more of that continues, but football is such a difficult space that I fear that the drive for, the profit and loss column and the representation of clubs or better performances of clubs in Europe may force the Bundesliga's hand. That's just a fear that I have, because I think there's so much to be respected about the approach to development. I would hope that the person continues to play a pivotal role in the development of football teams, but I feel that there is a lot more work that can be done. And that needs to be addressed moving forward, because we really do need to consider everybody as a person, as a Mensch. And, if we don't do that, then I think in some ways we're not doing the job properly.
Fantastic. And I have to say that I really, really enjoyed reading this book. It's absolutely invaluable read for any coach, anyone interested in any part of the game or any part of sports coaching and German football. So it's wide ranging for the audience. How can people purchase the book, and how can people reach out to you? Because I'm sure there will be people interested in asking you some questions based on what we spoke about today. So how can they find the book? How can they reach out to you?
Well, thank you for those kind words, first and foremost. I appreciate that. Amazon, it's on Amazon, so Mensch, Beyond the Cones, just put that in. You can also get it on Oakley Books, which is my publishing house, and I'm on Twitter at JohnBlog66.
Brilliant, perfect, fantastic. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, everyone, wasn't that an absolutely fantastic podcast? I really enjoyed that. Learnt loads from Jonathan's book. Mensch. As he said, you can get that on Amazon. I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks of the podcast, of the Sports Psych Show, so please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, guests or format, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm really looking forward to next week's show. Bye for now.